University and also the former president of the American College of Cardiology. Ladies and gentlemen, the one, the only, Dr. Kim Williams. Welcome back to the show, my friend.
Thank you so much, Jeff. Thanks for having me.
Let's start with a really interesting study. And this is one that is a large-scale study where the authors concluded that vegetables, get this, Dr. Williams, do not protect against cardiovascular disease. Now, I got my hands on a press release. I know that you have seen the full study, but let me just read you a paragraph out of this press release that absolutely blew my mind. The press release reads, quote, that the consumption of vegetables might lower the risk of cardiovascular disease might at first seem plausible, as their ingredients, such as carotenoids and others, have properties that could protect against CVD, but the evidence from previous studies for an overall effect of vegetable consumption on cardiovascular disease has been inconsistent. Dr. Williams, I'm not trying to be biased here, but I have never seen a study that shows anything other than a positive effect on vegetable consumption in terms of heart health. Help me understand this study.
Well, it's an interesting study, mostly from, have to disclose that I'm a journal editor, and I looked at this as a preprint before publication or before the embargo was lifted, and I just have to say I was just kind of blown away by the fact that the methodology included tablespoons, not cups, but tablespoons of vegetables. And so they purported to be studying raw versus cooked, found a little bit of an advantage for raw, not so much for cooked. And, my takeaway was that, the raw data in this project really meant that the conclusions were overcooked. The other take that I had on it is that a tablespoon of veggies and a pinch of truth. I mean, I don't know how to interpret it. It really is far below what people should be taking in. If you looked at our national guidelines for nutrition, they would say that people should be eating 3 to 4 cups of vegetables per day, each cup being 240 ml, each tablespoon being 15 ml. And so they were looking at really a tiny amount of vegetables. That might have, I would have thought that somehow was a statistical error or a printing error, but that they seem to be serious about it. But I would think that the amount of vegetables taken in might have reached statistically a significant level in terms of a difference or a lack of difference, but it was clinically insignificant. It's not something that we would be recommending to our patients. So I don't think that this study applies to really anyone.
So let me just put this in lay terms and make sure that I'm understanding you correctly. The study here looked at vegetable consumption in terms of 2 to maybe 3 tablespoons per day when we're recommended to have, 4 cups of vegetables per day, something like that. So we're looking at a fractional amount of our recommended intake of vegetables, and they're still saying this conclusion. To me, sir, that is mind-boggling. Again, not trying to be biased, but as you said, it's really kind of confusing how someone could draw that conclusion.
And I would think that, and I'm hoping that someone will correct me and send in the thing, or correct the article either way, so that we get some meaningful information out of it. But right now, I would say that it's making a lot of news, and unfortunately, the news is extracting conclusions that really aren't justified. Unfortunately, it's blitz that makes the news, and bad science gets published all the time, makes the news regardless of how applicable, or in this case, not applicable, it actually is. So I'm hoping that there will be, retraction or retrenchment or repeat the study in another population that is eating it. But it's very clear that if you're eating, 2 to 3 tablespoons of vegetables, whether they're raw or cooked, then your outcome is going to be dominated by the rest of what you're eating. And so that really needs to be analyzed thoroughly before anyone can make any conclusions about nutrition and outcomes.
Yeah, and the authors here said that really when it comes to cardiovascular risk, instead of it being with vegetables, they concluded that it had to do with socioeconomics and other lifestyle factors, which of course those play a part. But to your point about journalists, being a former newsman, journalists are actually put in almost an impossible situation. And most of us are general assignment reporters. So one day we might be covering a court case. The next day we might be covering a fire. And then on this particular day, it would be a study about heart health. And no knock on journalists. Very few of us have gone to medical school. We don't know how to interpret this data, so we would rely on these press releases, and the press releases have cherry-picked quotes like, instead, our analysis showed that seemingly protective effect of vegetable intake against cardiovascular risk is likely accounted for by bias from residual confounding factors related to socioeconomic situations and lifestyle. So, I mean, that's a heck of a sentence for somebody who's not ingrained in the health community to interpret as it is. But then also, as you just said, I mean, it's a glitzy headline. Vegetables aren't heart healthy after all. Like, you know, it's an impossible situation for a journalist. I just wanted to let you know that the journalists aren't out there to get you. We just don't know. We just don't know.
Can I agree and disagree at the same time? That is, I agree with the journalists. The disagreement is physicians aren't much different. So, you know, you've got somebody telling you to get the patients in and out of your room in the next 15 minutes. They're going to grab the headlines as well. They're not going to go and look at the paper in detail unless you happen to be very interested in that area. And so, you know, the same is probably true for me. When somebody does a study on, you know, let's say, you know, third world countries and parasites, I'm probably not going to read the details of that because it's so far away from what I do. But I'm definitely going to read something about cardiovascular mortality. And so what I get is that if you're talking about 2 to 3, you know, tablespoons of vegetables, the conclusion I would draw is that vegetables do not help your cardiovascular outcomes if you don't eat them.
I don't think that there's a better way to sum it up than that. So let's bump to another study, this one looking specifically at hypertension. And I was flipping through your Twitter timeline before our interview. You retweeted somebody that was talking about how hypertension was a form of cardiovascular disease. Would you agree with that?
It is, and you know, and it is the ultimate form of. I mean, everyone thinks about heart attack, you know, stroke and death, and heart failure, but hypertension is frequently at the root of all of those. That it stiffens the blood vessels, it promotes plaque, so that people do have more heart attacks when they're significantly hypertensive, and it's obviously a big stroke risk, and so it ruins your kidneys as well. And end-stage renal disease is one of the biggest risk factors for rapid development of cardiovascular disease. About 12 different mechanisms of why having bad kidneys makes your heart bad. And so it's really critical that, and in fact, that has been analyzed around the world. World Health Organization data says that the number one contributor to mortality, this is pre-COVID, was actually hypertension because of everything else that it did.
Well, boy, that brings us to the next study, which this one I reported on recently on the show, but I would love to get your opinion on it. And you just talked about the pandemic with hypertension. I mean, this study that was published in the American Heart Journal found that the percentage of adults in America who have uncontrolled blood pressure rose from 15% pre-pandemic to 19% today. That's 1 out of 5 almost. And the layperson might say, well, hey, you know, that's not that big of a change. But as somebody who really works to combat negative heart health, you know, and improve people's cardiovascular fitness here, that's got to really sound some alarms for you.
Well, in a way, but can I put that into perspective for a second?
Sure.
We're used to some third world countries and our inner cities, in fact, having some 50-50-50 when it comes to blood pressure, meaning 50% of people who have hypertension know about it. Number two, 50% who know about it are actually treated, and then those who are treated, only 50% are controlled. The interesting thing is that those numbers are skewed in the African American community, the most hypertensive population in the United States. It's more like 70-50-70, meaning that we have a lot of recognition of blood pressure. People know they have it, but not all of enough people are being treated, and then 70% of the people being uncontrolled. And so I think those numbers are getting some better, and at least they were before COVID. We're doing a lot in the communities to try to make those numbers much more reasonable. You know, and we in Chicago, we've been working with dental offices, but we need to do the barbershop thing that they did in Los Angeles, and then we need to go to nail salons because the guys don't go there, but the women do. We need community efforts, and the dental office is a great place because you know, people are usually in pain and scared of the dentist, and their blood pressure is going to be a little higher, and that so-called office hypertension or situational hypertension actually predicts future hypertension. So good to identify them there. So, but what you're really talking about is the change that happened with COVID, and that really was a lot of isolation, less exercise, people are not going to gyms, and you're going to see that 12, 18 months down the road, that COVID-20, the increase in weight that people were getting, is really going to have its effects, particularly so-called systemic vascular resistance, air quotes, meaning that as your blood pressure, as you gain weight, your blood vessels will have a higher resistance, which is going to raise your blood pressure. It puts more work on your heart, and there's nothing good about it. And people were eating the wrong kinds of foods. We know what produces high blood pressure, and that's alcohol, which probably deserves a special paragraph because everyone recognized that the alcohol manufacturers and retailers were going wild during COVID because people were staying at home and they were drinking more. So that is, and our recommendations, to be honest, our recommendations in our 2017 guidelines, we used the best data that we had, from 2015 to 2017, which said a woman should never have more than 1 drink per day, and a man should not have more than 2. Well, of course, like any guideline committee, we get burned because something else gets published. And so now the recommendation would be that no one, regardless of gender, should actually be eating or drinking more than 1 drink per day. And so we had a lot of people who were overdoing it with alcohol. They weren't exercising. They were eating high-fat, comfort, high-salt food. And so this is really a natural outcome, and we need to reverse it. We need to get the public service messages, like you're doing, Chuck. Get this message out there to people. Whole food, plant-based diet, daily exercise, back off the booze, just enough to make sure that the blood pressure is normal.
I want to come back to alcohol in just a second, but one of the things in this research that the lead author really wanted to underscore was the fact that even a change in just a few millimeters can have a measurable difference in terms of a person's risk for a heart attack or a stroke. How little, like if we're talking about jumping from 120 over 80 to maybe 130 over 85, what does that do for a person's risk? That, to me, doesn't seem like such an enormous jump, but from a physician standpoint, what's really happening there?
So if you look at our 2017 guidelines, you see one really shocking thing. That is the increase in mortality starts at like 115. So that's the baseline for the top number, systolic pressure of 115. For every 15 millimeters, the cardiovascular mortality and morbidity doubles. And so people need to understand that this is a high-risk area, and we need to keep those numbers as low as we recommend in the guidelines, which is, less than 130 is our target for treatment, but we define anything greater than 120 as elevated, with good reason, because you can see a little difference. Now, the question is, should you be using drugs to get your blood pressure below 130, below 120? Probably not. We would prefer lifestyle, and it was so funny when this was a little side note here. When the guidelines came out, we were immediately accused because we changed the definition and the target from 140 over 90 to 130 over 80. They said we were in the pocket of the drug industry. He said, that means you didn't read the document, because we were talking about decreasing the alcohol I mentioned, a limit in sodium to 1,800 milligrams per day, increasing potassium intake to more than 3,500 milligrams per day, changing to a predominantly, if not exclusively, plant-based diet, doing exercise, getting above 150 minutes in multiple modalities of exercise, and losing weight. And if you do all those things, most people don't actually need drugs, but they just need to pay attention to the lifestyle factors that develop the hypertension in the first place.
And just as a refresher, this audience predominantly plant-based, if not exclusively plant-based, except for a couple people who just like to, needle us every now and again. The statistics, the data that we have here on a plant-based diet, that effect, a healthy whole food plant-based diet, that effect on a person's hypertension is what?
So it's interesting that we have multiple trials. If you look at that little sign behind you, PCRM, this was an organization that has published multiple risk factors, okay, and the effect of diet and multiple interventions. And there's a little bit of diabetes, one publication, massive amount on lipids, massive amount on hypertension. If you look at those guidelines, and then you look at some of the randomized trials that have been done by PCRM, Neil Barnard, as well as external, it's very clear that the more plant-based you are, the lower the blood pressure. We have massive databases, everything from Harvard's Nurses Health and Physician Health Professional Follow-up Study. You have Adventists making a big distinction in frequency of hypertension from whole food, from completely vegan, or is what they're calling it, but it's more of a whole food plant-based diet versus vegetarian. And certainly vegetarian was even better than pesco-vegetarian, eating fish, which was better than the semi-vegetarian, which was better than a standard American diet. So the more you go on that scale toward a whole food plant-based diet, the lower the blood pressure is going to be.
All right, now let's get back to that alcohol talk here, because again, flipping through your Twitter timeline, I laughed a couple of times, one of which was something that you retweeted. And this was a screenshot of a TV news interview where the banner across the bottom said, World Heart Federation, no amount of alcohol is safe for heart. And then the person's actual tweet, the text of that read flat out, I do not need this today. That part made me laugh, but you know, we've heard previously that wine can be heart healthy. You were talking about limiting alcohol to just one drink per day. You know, what is your general advice for somebody when it comes to having that beer, having a glass of wine after work every day?
So it's an interesting phenomenon, and every once in a while I have to disclose my conflicts of interest, whether they're never financial, but they're certainly intellectual. And mine is, I hate alcohol. I know how people drink it. I can't swallow it. It's just terrible. You know, it burns my mouth, burns my throat, and it puts me to sleep. So why do people do this? So having said that out loud, I was always looking for that World Heart Federation data, for somebody to give us a break, because all we've heard for decades is that alcohol was going to keep your cholesterol soluble. That was actually data from Michigan State's George Abella, where he had cholesterol crystals that could be inhibited by statins and by alcohol. And then you actually had an opportunity to see data on resveratrol and red wine and the French paradox. And there were always people nipping at the French saying, you know, maybe it's your diagnosis of heart disease that's a problem way back in the 60s and 70s, and that alcohol isn't really doing much for you. But I think what basically, if you were to look very hard and very carefully, there really is no benefit of alcohol. It does kill brain cells, which most of us don't want to afford. And you never know if you're going to be the person who develops alcoholic liver disease with a relatively low amount, which most people don't, but some do, or alcoholic cardiomyopathy. But it certainly adds to blood pressure, and it certainly adds to triglycerides, hypertriglyceridemia. You know, the triglycerides don't get a lot of respect, okay? They're sort of the Rodney Dangerfield of the lipid